35 is a long time to be alone, Mrs. Chen, the storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, said, his voice a slick veneer over a core of casual cruelty. He leaned against his counter, arms crossed over his portly stomach, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. A woman withers on the vine, you know. Especially out here. And Lee clutched the small sack of flour to her chest, the coarse fabric a flimsy shield against his words. The comment hung in the cold, dusty air of the general store, thick with the scent of salted pork and dried tobacco. She kept her gaze fixed on the worn floorboards, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had heard variations of this sentiment for years, ever since her husband, Wei, had been taken by the fever that swept through the railroad camp. At 30, she was a widow. Now, at 35, she was a town fixture, the quiet, aging Chinese woman in the faded beige dress, a ghost haunting the edges of their rough-hewn society. She offered a stiff, barely perceptible nod, her pride a fragile wall against the humiliation. "Thank you for the flour, Mr. Abernathy." Her voice was a whisper, easily swallowed by the vast, indifferent space. She turned to leave, her movements precise and contained, a habit born of a lifetime of trying to take up as little space as possible. Outside, the world was a study in grey and brown. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of pewter, and the street was a treacherous river of half-frozen mud. The biting winter wind whipped at her dress, stealing the breath from her lungs. She hurried, her head down, wanting only the sanctuary of her small, lonely cabin at the town's fringe. Her mind was a whirlwind of Abernathy's words, "withers on the vine." The phrase was a stone in her gut. It was in her haste, blinded by unshed tears of anger and sorrow, that her foot slipped. A patch of black ice, hidden beneath a thin layer of mud, betrayed her. Her ankle twisted with a sickening, grinding pop, and a cry of pure, unadulterated pain was torn from her throat as she crashed down into the filthy slush. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, the cold seeping through her dress, the pain a white-hot fire racing up her leg. People stopped. They stared. A few women gasped, hands flying to their mouths, but no one moved to help. She was an oddity, a problem, and her public suffering was merely an inconvenience, a disruption in the daily flow of their hard lives. The world blurred into a miserable tableau of gawking faces and indifferent skies. A shadow fell over her. It was immense, blocking out the meager light from the oppressive sky. The murmuring of the small crowd died instantly, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. And Lee, squinting through the pane, looked up into the most formidable man she had ever seen. He was a giant, seemingly carved from the mountain granite itself. A wild, tangled mane of dark hair, shot through with threads of silver, fell to his broad shoulders, and a thick, formidable beard covered the lower half of his face, unable to conceal the stern set of his jaw. He was wrapped in heavy furs that made him seem even larger, and the scent of pine, cold stone, and wood smoke clung to him like a second skin. This was the man they whispered about in town, the recluse who lived deep in the snow-capped peaks, a figure of myth and fear. Finian. He knelt beside her, his movements surprisingly fluid for a man of his size. The frozen mud groaned under his weight. His eyes, a startling clear blue amidst the rugged landscape of his face, held no pity, only a quiet, focused intensity. "Where does it hurt?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like stone shifting deep within the earth. It was not unkind. And Lee flinched, both from the pain and from the sheer proximity of him. She tried to pull herself up, to preserve some shred of dignity, but another bolt of agony shot through her ankle, and she fell back with a gasp. "My ankle," she managed to breathe, gesturing with a trembling hand. I think it is broken." He barely glanced at the gathering onlookers, his dismissal of them absolute. His large, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle, moved to her leg. He probed the area around her boot with a practiced touch, his fingers finding the source of the swelling with an unnerving precision. She winced, biting her lip to keep from crying out again. "It's not broken," he stated, his gaze meeting hers. "But it's a bad sprain. You can't walk on it." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Before she could process what was happening, he had scooped her into his arms. She gave a small, startled cry. She was weightless to him. He held her against his solid chest, one arm securely under her knees, the other supporting her back. The warmth from his body was a shocking contrast to the biting cold. The crowd stared, their mouths agape. To see the feared mountain man in the center of town was rare enough. To see him carrying the Chinese widow was an event beyond comprehension. He began to walk, his long, powerful strides eating up the muddy ground. An-Li buried her face in the rough fur of his coat, a hot flush of shame and terror washing over her. Every window she passed seemed to hold a pair of judging eyes, every whisper seemed to be about her. The town of redemption, which had offered her none, was now her unwilling audience. To be so helpless, so exposed, was a torment. Yet, beneath the humiliation, a strange and unwelcome sensation began to bloom, a feeling of profound safety. The arms holding her were like iron bands, unyielding and absolute. The steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her ear was a grounding sound in the chaos of her own racing pulse. He smelled of the wilderness, clean, sharp, and wild. It was a scent of a world far removed from the stale air of Abernathy's store and the perpetual judgment of the town. He walked right through the center of town, ignoring the pointed stares and hushed comments that followed in his wake. He moved with a purpose that seemed to carve a path through their disapproval. An-Li risked a glance up at his face. His expression was impassive, his gaze fixed forward, as if the entire town and its inhabitants were nothing more than inconvenient scenery. "Where do you live?" he asked, his voice still that low, quiet rumble. He didn't look down at her, his focus remaining on the path ahead. She hesitated for a second, the instinct to remain invisible warring with the necessity of the moment. "The small cabin," she said, her voice muffled by his coat. "Past the livery." By the creek he gave a slight nod, a barely perceptible motion, and adjusted his course. The houses grew sparser, the well-trodden street giving way to a less defined path. Her home was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs, small and solitary, set apart from the rest of the community just as she was. It was her refuge, and now this stranger, this mountain giant, was carrying her to its door. He paused before the entrance, waiting. She fumbled inside her pocket with her free hand, her fingers numb with cold, and produced a small, iron key. He took it from her, unlocked the door with one swift motion, and pushed it open with his shoulder before carrying her across the threshold into the dim, cold interior of her life. He moved through her small, one-room cabin as if he belonged there, his large frame filling the space but never seeming clumsy. With the same gentleness he had shown her outside, he laid her down on the narrow cot that served as her bed, carefully propping her injured leg on a rolled-up blanket. The room was cold, the embers in the small stone hearth little more than pale orange whispers against the grey ash. An-Li shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of the stark poverty of her surroundings. The cabin was immaculately clean, every meager possession in its place, but it was undeniably bare. A simple table, one chair, a small chest for her clothes, and the cot. It was the home of a woman who expected no visitors. Finian's gaze swept the room, taking in the cold hearth and the empty water bucket by the door. He said nothing, but a decision formed in his eyes. He went to the hearth, and with a few deft movements, he used the small kindling she had stacked and a flint from his own pouch to coax the embers back to life. Soon, a small, hungry flame was licking at the logs, and a welcome warmth began to push back against the room's oppressive chill. He then took her bucket and left without a word. An-Li watched him go, bewildered. She heard the crunch of his boots on the snow-crusted ground, then the rhythmic creak of the town well. He returned moments later, the bucket filled to the brim with icy water, not a single drop spilled. He set it down and then turned his attention back to her. "I need to bind this," he said, gesturing to her ankle, which was now visibly swollen and turning a bruised shade of purple. Before she could protest or offer him a strip of her own cloth, he pulled a knife from his belt, a formidable, practical blade, and sliced a long, clean strip from the hem of his own worn linen shirt. He knelt again, and with an expertise that spoke of long familiarity with injuries, he wrapped her ankle tightly, the pressure firm but not painful. The simple, human touch was so foreign, so unexpected, that tears pricked at the back of her eyes. "Do you have anyone?" he asked, his voice soft as he tied off the binding. "To help you?" The question was direct, devoid of pity. She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump forming in her throat. The answer was too stark, too lonely. "I will come back," he said, standing to his full, intimidating height. "I'll bring herbs for a poultice. It will help with the swelling." He looked at her for a long moment, his clear blue eyes seeming to see right through the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart. Then, he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. And Lee was left alone in the sudden, profound silence, the warmth of the fire on her skin and the ghost of his presence, the scent of pine and the startling memory of kindness, lingering in the air. True to his word, Finian returned the following afternoon. The sky had cleared, and the winter sun cast long, sharp shadows across the snow. And Lee heard his heavy tread long before he reached the door. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She had spent the night in a state of disbelief, replaying his actions, the feel of his strong arms, the quiet rumble of his voice. It felt like a fever dream. When his knock came, it was a soft, hesitant sound, a stark contrast to his imposing figure. She called for him to enter, and he did, ducking his head to clear the low door frame. In one hand, he carried a small leather pouch, and in the other, 2 plump rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot. He placed the rabbits on her small table without ceremony. "For your stew," he said simply. He then opened the pouch and showed her a mixture of dried leaves and roots. "Mullein and comfrey," he explained, his voice low. "Grind them into a paste with hot water. It will draw out the pain." He set about preparing the poultice himself, moving with a quiet efficiency that she found mesmerizing. He crushed the herbs using a cup and the handle of his knife, added hot water from the kettle he'd placed over the fire, and created a thick, fragrant paste. He gently unwrapped her ankle, his touch sending a shiver through her, and applied the warm mixture before rebinding it. The relief was almost immediate, a soothing warmth that seeped deep into her aching joint. He then turned his attention to the rabbits, expertly jointing them and adding them to her stew pot with the few vegetables she had on hand. While the stew simmered, filling the small cabin with a rich, savory aroma, he sat not in her only chair, but on the floor by the fire, his back against the stone hearth. The silence between them was not awkward, but companionable, filled with the crackling of the flames. "Why did you help me?" Lee finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "No one else was going to," he said, as if it were the simplest, most obvious reason in the world. They began to talk, in hesitant fits and starts. She told him about her journey across the ocean, the hope she and Wei had carried, and the swift, brutal way that hope had been extinguished. He listened, his gaze never leaving the fire, his presence a silent, solid anchor. He, in turn, spoke of the mountains, of the way the light changed on the peaks at dawn, of the silence of a heavy snowfall. He spoke of the world he had made for himself, but not of the world he had left behind. Each day, he returned. He brought firewood, fresh water, and food. The town watched, and the town whispered. The sight of the mountain man's daily pilgrimage to the Chinese widow's cabin became a source of rampant speculation and suspicion. Mr. Abernathy held court in his store, his pronouncements growing darker. "It ain't natural," he declared to his customers. "A heathen giant and that foreign woman. He's a savage, and she's drawing his shadow over all of us. No good will come of it. No good at all." The whispers grew into a low, menacing hum that followed Lee whenever she was forced to hobble to her door for a breath of air. The town's suspicion, once a passive force, was beginning to curdle into active hostility. Children who once ignored her now sometimes threw pebbles at her cabin, their parents doing nothing to stop them. Deliveries of essential goods she had arranged were forgotten. Redemption was closing its doors to her, one by one. The escalation came on a bitterly cold afternoon, a week after her fall. Finian had just left, his formidable shape disappearing over the rise. Lee was sitting by her window, watching the weak sunlight glitter on the pristine snow, when she saw them approaching. It was Mr. Abernathy, and behind him stood 3 other men from the town, a blacksmith and 2 ranch hands she recognized by sight. Their faces were set in grim, determined lines. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile peace she had started to feel. She stood, her hand instinctively going to the sturdy poker by the hearth as they stopped in front of her door. Abernathy pounded on the wood with his fist. "Mrs. Chen! We need a word with you." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she would not cower. Not anymore. She opened the door, her knuckles white on the poker, and faced them from the threshold, her injured ankle throbbing in protest. "What do you want, Mr. Abernathy?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "We want you to stop," he said, his voice laced with false righteousness. "This town has been good to you. We've let you stay here in peace. But you're bringing trouble now. That a mountain man. He's not welcome here, and neither is the trouble he brings." The blacksmith, a burly man with soot permanently ingrained in his skin, stepped forward. "This is a decent town, Mrs. Chen. We have families. We don't want his kind sniffing around. Or yours, for that matter. It's time you moved on." The threat was no longer veiled. It was raw and ugly, laid bare in the cold winter air. They wanted her gone. They were using Finian as an excuse to purge the person they had only ever tolerated. Anneli's fear gave way to a surge of cold fury. "I have done nothing," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "This is my home," Abernathy sneered. "It was. But your welcome has run out. You and your savage friend need to be gone by the end of the week. Or we'll make you go from the ridge." A figure paused. Finian, on his way back to his mountain home, had felt a prickle of unease, an instinct honed by years of solitude. He turned, his sharp eyes scanning the distance, and saw the cluster of men outside Anneli's cabin. He saw their aggressive postures, and he saw her, small and defiant, standing alone against them. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. He turned and began to move back towards the cabin, his long stride silent and deadly on the snow. Finian covered the distance with the swift, silent grace of a predator. The men, caught up in their intimidation, did not hear him until his shadow fell over them once more, a chilling echo of the day he had first found. And Abernathy spun around, his face paling as he took in the sight of the mountain man. Finian's expression was glacial. The quiet compassion he showed Lee was gone, replaced by a cold, protective fury that seemed to radiate from him, more menacing than any weapon. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply moved, placing his massive form squarely between Lee and the hostile group. "Leave her be," he said. The two words were a low, guttural command, vibrating with a promise of violence that made the air crackle. Abernathy, emboldened by his companions, tried to bluster. "Now, see here, this is town business." "It has nothing to do with," I said, Finian interrupted, taking a single, deliberate step forward. "Leave her be." His blue eyes were chips of ice, and they were locked on Abernathy. The storekeeper's bravado evaporated under that unwavering, lethal gaze. He swallowed hard, taking an involuntary step back. The blacksmith and the ranch hands, who made their living on bluster and brute force, suddenly seemed to find the tips of their boots intensely interesting. They recognized a force of nature they could not hope to challenge. Without another word, they shuffled backward, turned, and retreated with as much dignity as they could muster, which wasn't much. Abernathy shot one last, venomous look at Lee before scurrying after them. Silence descended, heavy and profound. Finian stood for a long moment, his back to her, a silent guardian watching the cowards disappear. Then, he slowly turned. The fury drained from his face, replaced by a deep, weary concern as he looked at her. Lee was trembling, the poker slipping from her nerveless fingers and clattering to the floor. The confrontation had shattered her fragile composure. All her worst fears had come to pass. She was a burden. A source of trouble. He would leave now. He had to. "They will not let us be," she whispered, her voice breaking. She looked at her hands, at the simple beige dress, at the lonely cabin around her. "It is because of me. They say I am too old. Too different." A plague on their decent town. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. He saw the deep, ingrained pain in her posture, the years of quiet suffering now laid bare. He saw her resilience, and he saw it cracking. He reached out, his large, rough hand moving with incredible slowness, and gently cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The touch was electric, a point of impossible warmth in the cold. She looked up at him, her dark eyes swimming with sorrow and confusion. "You should go," she whispered. "Before they bring you more trouble." He shook his head slowly, his gaze holding hers. "They called me a savage," he said, his voice soft again, full of a strange, raw vulnerability. "They look at you and see a withered vine." He paused, his thumb stroking her skin. "They see nothing." "When I look at you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with an emotion she couldn't dare to name, "you're perfect for me." The words hung in the air between them, simple, profound, and utterly transformative. Perfect for me. It was not a declaration of flowery romance, but something far deeper, a statement of recognition, of seeing and being seen for exactly who they were. For Lee, who had spent years feeling like a flawed, forgotten remnant, the words were a balm on a wound she didn't know was still bleeding. For Finian, who had exiled himself from a world that saw him as a monster, it was an admission that he had found a place of belonging not in a location, but in a person. The incident with Abernathy did not go unnoticed. Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary face was a roadmap of the territory's troubles, heard about it before the sun had set. Miller was a practical man who valued order above all else. He had little time for the town's prejudices. The next morning, he paid a visit to the general store. He didn't raise his voice, but his quiet conversation with Abernathy, held over the cracker barrel, was enough. He spoke of federal laws protecting citizens, of harassment, and of the long arm of the law reaching even into the affairs of men who thought themselves insulated by public opinion. Abernathy's campaign of overt hostility ceased, retreating back into the sullen glares and muttered resentments that Lee was already accustomed to. The immediate threat had passed. In the days that followed, something shifted between Lee and Finian. The space between them, once filled with cautious silence, now held a quiet intimacy. He no longer just brought her provisions, he stayed. He would sit by her fire and tell her the story he had told no one else. He spoke of a wife named Aoife, with hair the color of autumn leaves, and a small son, Ronan, with his mother's bright laugh. He told her how the fever had swept through their small homestead in a single, brutal week, leaving him utterly alone in a world that had lost its color. The mountains were the only place quiet enough for the grief, he explained, his gaze lost in the flames. Lee listened, her heart aching for the immense sorrow he carried. And she, in turn, told him of Wei, of his gentle hands and his dreams of opening a small tea house. She spoke of the loneliness that had been her constant companion, a cold blanket she had pulled around herself for so long she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. One afternoon, as her ankle grew stronger, he looked at her across the small cabin. "When you can walk the path," he said, "I want you to see my home." Up there he nodded towards the window, towards the towering, snow-dusted peaks that dominated the horizon. It wasn't just an invitation, it was an offering. He was offering her a glimpse into his world, the sanctuary he had built from his pain. She looked at the mountains, which had always seemed so remote and menacing, and for the first time, saw not a threat, but a promise. A promise of a place beyond judgment, beyond the prying eyes of the town. "I would like that," she said, and a genuine smile, the first in a very long time, lit up her face. Her ankle healed. The deep, bruising purple faded to a pale yellow and then disappeared altogether, leaving only a slight stiffness that lessened each day. With the healing of her body came a healing of her spirit. The faded beige dress she wore no longer seemed like the uniform of a perpetual mourner. It was just a dress. She began to take more care with her appearance, braiding her long, dark hair with a renewed sense of self-worth. The haunted, guarded look in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet, steady light. She was no longer just Lee, the Chinese widow. She was Lee, a woman who was seen, a woman who was valued. A woman who looked at the formidable mountain man not with fear but with a deep, burgeoning affection that felt as solid and real as the earth beneath her feet. Finian's transformation was just as profound. The harsh lines of grief around his eyes softened. The solitary giant who descended from the mountain only for necessities now had a reason to come to the edge of town, a reason that had nothing to do with flour or salt. He brought her things from his world, a hawk's feather of impossible softness, a branch of pine heavy with the clean mountain scent, and one day, a small, perfectly smooth, grey stone he'd plucked from a rushing alpine stream. He pressed it into her palm. It has been shaped by the water for 1,000 years, he told her, his large hand closing over hers. It endures. The stone was not beautiful or valuable in the way the world measured such things. It was simple, strong, and constant. It was a perfect symbol of him, and of the love growing between them. It was a promise of endurance. She closed her fingers around it, its coolness a comforting weight in her hand. This small, simple gift meant more to her than all the gold in the territory. It was a piece of his world, a world she was now invited to share. She was moving from a life of isolation toward a future of belonging, a future with a man who had also been isolated by his own pain. Together, they were finding their way out of the wilderness of their pasts. Have you ever felt so seen by another person that it changed the very way you saw yourself? It is a rare and precious gift, one that can mend the deepest of fractures in the human heart. That was the gift Finian and Lee gave to each other, a quiet miracle in a harsh and unforgiving land. The long, hard winter finally broke. The iron grip of the frost loosened its hold, and the world began to weep. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, and the thick blanket of snow receded, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. The path up into the mountains, once an impassable white expanse, was now a muddy but discernible trail. The air, for the first time in months, carried the scent of wet soil and the promise of new life. One morning, with the sun shining with a newfound strength, Finian arrived. He wasn't carrying firewood or game. His hands were empty. He stood in her doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the bright morning light. "The path is clear," he said. It was all he needed to say. And Lee was ready. She had packed her few precious belongings into a single, small bundle, a change of clothes, her mother's jade pendant, and the smooth grey river stone he had given her. She looked around the small, bare cabin one last time. It had been her prison and her sanctuary, a place of profound loneliness and, unexpectedly, the starting point of her salvation. She felt a pang of nostalgia not for the place itself, but for the journey she had undergone within its walls. She took a deep breath and walked out, pulling the door closed on her old life. She did not lock it. There was nothing left in it for her, and nothing she wished to keep anyone from. This time, Finian did not carry her. She walked beside him. Her limp was nearly gone, a faint, rhythmic reminder of the fall that had, paradoxically, set her free. They walked away from the cabin, their footsteps falling in sync on the damp ground. They passed the edge of town without looking back. The judgmental eyes and cruel whispers of redemption no longer had any power over them. They were walking towards a different kind of redemption, one they would build for themselves. The ascent was steep, but Lee felt a surprising strength in her limbs. The air grew thinner, cleaner, filled with the scent of pine and melting snow. The world opened up below them, the town shrinking until it was just a small, insignificant collection of buildings in the vast expanse of the valley. Finian led her with a quiet confidence, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady her on a slippery rock or a steep incline. They didn't speak much. Words were unnecessary. The shared journey, the unified movement towards a single destination, was a conversation all its own. As the sun reached its zenith, they crested a high ridge. Below them, nestled in a small, sheltered valley, was his home. It was a sturdy log cabin, larger than hers, with smoke curling from a stone chimney, a testament to a life of self-sufficiency and solitude. It was not a place of exile, it was a fortress of peace. The vast, dramatic backdrop of the mountains cradles them, their raw power a reflection of the strength of the bond between these two solitary souls. The sun breaks through the clouds, bathing the entire scene in a warm, golden light. It illuminates their path forward, a symbolic and hopeful promise of a new season, a new home, and a family forged not by blood or convention, but by the extraordinary courage to see the perfection in another's brokenness.